One set of miracles that Christ promised to perform in the Gospels were subsequently reported by our best historians of this period, who came from opposite sides of a war, both living at the time of the events, neither of them Christians. Each agrees and reports these miracles did come to pass, though they were unaware of Jesus' connection. Christ had warned that Jerusalem's destruction was coming, and what to look out for to signify that the time for its destruction was arriving. In Luke chapter 21 verse 11 he stated that prior to Jerusalem's destruction there would be warnings, fearful events and great signs from heaven, that showed that the time had arrived. In 70 AD, after several years of brutal war in which Israel was devastated, the Romans besieged Jerusalem and brought one of the largest slaughters in ancient history. They killed almost every single person in the city, over 1 million people. Before this terrible siege, the signs that warned of it, which Christ had promised, did indeed occur, and were witnessed publicly by the entire population. Our historical sources record that the signs were truly incredible, and unmistakably divine. Heavenly armies were seen in the sky throughout all of Israel, surrounding Jerusalem and other cities in the nation. A light shined down from the heavens on the temple in the middle of the night, lighting it up as brightly as if it were day. The temple's colossal and firmly fastened gate was seen opening up wide, all on its own, without the team of at least 20 men that it usually took to even shut it. A star shaped like a sword was in the sky over the city. That's no metaphor. Our earliest source describes a star literally in the form of a rhomphaea in the sky over Jerusalem. We have non-Christian attestation from contemporary historical sources of the highest caliber to these and other divine warning signs shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem, making them some of the best recorded and most easily verifiable miracles in all of history. Our two most significant sources come from both of the two opposing sides of the Jewish-Roman War, Tacitus, a Roman historian, and Josephus, one of the generals on the Jewish side. Tacitus, our first source, was a member of the Roman government who, as the Encyclopaedia Britannica described him, was, quote, probably the greatest historian who wrote in the Latin language. In Book 5, Chapter 13 of his Histories he wrote that, quote, signs had indeed occurred. Armies were seen running about up in the skies, their weapons shining red. The temple was illuminated with light from the sky. Out of nowhere, the gates of the temple suddenly opened. A greater than mortal voice cried, saying, the gods are departing. And at that same moment there was a mighty disturbance, as if something was going out. Some few interpreted these omens as fearful, but in most there was a firm persuasion that these signs meant that they were to acquire a worldwide empire. Josephus, our next source, was a general of the Judean forces during this war, who became a historian afterwards and wrote an account of the conflict. His works were held in high regard. The historian Eusebius reports in Book 3, Chapter 9, Section 2 of his Ecclesiastical History that Josephus, quote, was the most noted of all the Jews of that day, not only among his own people, but also among the Romans, so that he was honored by the erection of a statue in Rome, and his works were deemed worthy of a place in the library. In Book 6, Chapter 5, Section 3 of his work The Jewish War, Josephus writes that, quote, they neither heeded nor credited the manifest signs that foretold the coming destruction, but, as if thunderstruck and bereft of eyes and mind, disregarded the plain warnings of God. Such it was, when there was a star in the shape of a sword which stood over the city. Such it was, again, when, before the Jews' rebellion, and before those commotions which preceded the war, at the time when the people had come in great crowds to Jerusalem for Passover, on the 8th day of the month Nisan, at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shined around the altar and the temple that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. At the same Passover also, the gate of the temple, which was made of bronze, and vastly heavy, and, when closed in the evening, could hardly be moved by 20 men, and which rested upon a base reinforced with iron and had bolts fastened very deep into the stone foundation, was seen to open of its own accord, about the 6th hour of the night. A few days after this Passover festival, on the 21st day of the month of Iyar, there was a manifestation of supernatural beings. What was witnessed was beyond belief. I suppose the account of it would seem to be some kind of myth, were it not related by those that saw it, for, before sunset, throughout the whole country, in the sky, chariots and formations of soldiers with their arms and armor were seen traversing the clouds, and they surrounded the cities. Moreover, at that festival which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that, they felt a quaking, and heard a great noise, and after that, they heard a voice like that of a great multitude, saying, Let us depart from here. We could not possibly ask for better historical sources than these. Tacitus and Josephus are recognized as being our two absolute best sources for 1st century Rome and Israel, each given the highest praise for their accuracy and reliability. Modern scholarship is filled with praise for Tacitus's accuracy and careful research as a historian. The classic scholar Moses Harders calls him the Romans' greatest historian, and talks about how he never consciously sacrifices historical truth. He consulted good sources, memoirs, biographies, and official records, and he frequently implies that he had more than one source before him. He requested information from those in a position to know. He exercises critical judgment in questioning the value of a biased account. It is hard to imagine how bare and distorted our picture of Tacitus's period would be without Tacitus. All that has been written upon it since is either a dim reflection of his insight or a lifeless extract from his writings. The historian Roland Meller wrote that, there can be little doubt that Tacitus engaged in serious research. Unlike Livy, who restricted himself to a few sources and refused to bestir himself to consult other easily available documents, Tacitus consulted both obvious and obscure sources. Like other Roman historians, Tacitus thought that personal research was important for the history of recent times, and he diligently sought eyewitness accounts of important events. The intelligence is Tacitus's own. Much of the detail comes from his diligent research in reminiscences, biographies, autobiographies, letters, as well as in the Acts of the Senate, a Roman approximation of the congressional record. The classics professor Herbert Bonario wrote that Tacitus, chose judiciously among his sources, totally dependent upon none, and very often, at crucial points, ignored the consensus of his predecessors. Many more examples like these could be brought forward. Almost any time you read about Tacitus, his accuracy, concern for the truth, thoroughness with research and discernment with sources, is praised. He is also known for being a very skeptical historian, always telling us when something is rumor or gossip, or if there is reason to doubt a report. And yet he shows no doubt about these events whatsoever, and takes them as matters of fact, even talking about how different portions of the population interpreted them. Josephus's report is perhaps even more powerful. He was, himself, an eyewitness to several of these miracles he reports. His autobiography confirms that he was personally present in Jerusalem, where he lived, when these miracles took place. His presence in Jerusalem at the religious festivals of Passover and Pentecost, during which the greatest of the signs took place, would, in fact, have been required by the Jewish law in Deuteronomy chapter 16 verse 16, which instructs all Jewish men to come to the temple at these times. As Josephus himself wrote, "For the history of the war, I wrote it as having been directly involved, myself, in many of its transactions, an eyewitness to the majority of the rest, and was not unacquainted with anything whatsoever that was either said or done in it." And those who would be in the best position to know about events in Jerusalem and Israel at this time directly attested to the accuracy of his account. Those who attested to the accuracy of Josephus's report are all some of those who would be best informed in the world on these events, including Agrippa II, the sitting king of Israel himself during the time that these miracles took place; Vespasian, the general who initially led the Roman forces in the Jewish-Roman War, and who was the sitting Roman emperor when he attested to the accuracy of Josephus's account; Titus, commander of the Roman forces in the war at Vespasian's side, who led the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, among others. Many more sources report the miracles that took place in Jerusalem, such as the Jerusalem Talmud. But this convergence of historical accounts by Tacitus and Josephus, the two most esteemed historians of these times, detailing such miraculous events is nothing short of awe-inspiring. It is important to recognize the weight of their credibility and the universal acknowledgement by scholars throughout history that their works are remarkably accurate. These accounts serve as pillars of trust upon which we build our very understanding of this entire period. If we were to refuse to acknowledge such meticulously documented events, we would be forced to deny the very possibility of discerning any truth about the ancient past. The implications of accepting the veracity of these reports go beyond mere historical curiosity, as these miracles at the temple and in Jerusalem plainly demonstrate the existence of the God worshipped at that temple and in Jerusalem. They hold the potential to transform our perception of reality and unveil fundamental truths that resonate across time from the past down to the present. Such evidence demands our attention and compels us to re-evaluate our preconceptions, opening the gate to a deeper understanding of the world we inhabit, just as the great gate of the temple opened to deepen the understanding of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And the implication of the message remains as clear today as it had been then. The God worshipped in that temple is the true God.